Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill quotes, Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill presents a comprehensive argument in favor of utilitarian ethics, which holds that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the opposite. Mill addresses common misunderstandings of utilitarianism, emphasizing that it values not just quantity, but quality of pleasures, and aims to balance individual good with the greatest happiness for all. By articulating the importance of justice, moral rights, and the ultimate ends of human action, Mill seeks to refine and defend utilitarian principles as a guide for ethical conduct. Quote 1. There are few circumstances among those which make up the present condition of human knowledge, more unlike what might have been expected, or more significant of the backward state in which speculation on the most important subjects still lingers, than the little progress which has been made in the decision of the controversy respecting the criterion of right and wrong. Mill begins by highlighting the stagnation in philosophical debate over morality, emphasizing that despite centuries of intellectual effort, there has been little consensus on how to determine what is morally right or wrong. This stagnation, he suggests, indicates the difficulty of the subject and the limitations of human understanding when it comes to ethical questions. He points out that since the time of ancient philosophers, such as Socrates and Protagoras, the fundamental question of what constitutes the highest good, or summum bonum, remains unanswered, and divisions persist. This quote sets the stage for Mill's argument that utilitarianism offers a potential solution to these enduring disagreements. Quote 2. All action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. Mill suggests that human actions are inherently purpose-driven, meaning that we engage in actions with specific goals in mind. Therefore, ethical rules should be understood in the context of the ends they serve. This is an important foundation of utilitarian thought, where the morality of an action is determined by its contribution to the overall good. By asserting that practical pursuits must begin with a clear understanding of their intended outcome, Mill is emphasizing the role of ends in defining and justifying moral behavior. Quote 3. The intuitive, no less than what may be termed the inductive, school of ethics, insists on the necessity of general laws. They both agree that the morality of an individual action is not a question of direct perception, but of the application of a law to an individual case. Here, Mill addresses two schools of ethical thought, the intuitive and the inductive. He points out that both approaches acknowledge the importance of general moral laws, rather than relying on immediate perceptions to determine right from wrong. This suggests that morality is systematic and requires the application of overarching principles to specific situations. By discussing these schools, Mill lays the groundwork for his argument that utilitarianism, too, operates through general principles, specifically those aimed at maximizing happiness, thereby seeking to align itself with this systematic approach to ethics. Quote 4. The principle of utility, or as Bentham latterly called it, the greatest happiness principle, has had a large share in forming the moral doctrines even of those who most scornfully reject its authority. Mill argues that even those who openly dismiss utilitarianism are influenced by its underlying values, particularly the idea that actions should be evaluated based on their impact on happiness. He suggests that the utilitarian principle has shaped modern moral thinking, consciously or unconsciously, and continues to be a significant factor in ethical reasoning. This demonstrates the pervasive influence of utilitarian ideas across different moral doctrines, implying that the focus on happiness is deeply ingrained in moral discourse, regardless of explicit adherence to utilitarian theory. Quote 5. Questions of ultimate ends are not amenable to direct proof. Whatever can be proved to be good must be so by being shown to be a means to something admitted to be good without proof. Mill highlights the inherent difficulty in providing proof for ultimate goals, such as happiness or moral good, since these ends are self-evident and not subject to further justification. He notes that while the utility of things like medical care or music can be proven through their outcomes, the goodness of happiness itself cannot be proved in the same manner. Instead, it must be accepted as inherently desirable. This distinction is crucial in understanding the limitations of rational proof when it comes to foundational ethical concepts, and underscores the idea that some aspects of moral philosophy are not directly demonstrable, but are intuitively accepted. Quote 6. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Mill defines the core of utilitarianism by emphasizing that morality is fundamentally tied to the promotion of happiness. Actions that increase happiness are considered morally right, while those that diminish it are considered wrong. By happiness, Mill refers to the experience of pleasure and the absence of pain. This foundational statement sets up the utilitarian framework where ethical decisions are evaluated based on their ability to contribute to overall well-being. Mill's description here establishes utilitarianism not merely as a pursuit of personal pleasure, but as an attempt to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. Quote 7. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine. Mill acknowledges a common criticism of utilitarianism, that it is a philosophy concerned only with basic pleasures, making it seem unworthy of human beings. Critics argue that reducing the purpose of life to the pursuit of pleasure degrades the nobler aspects of human existence. Mill uses this metaphor of swine to highlight how utilitarianism has been misunderstood as promoting base and shallow pleasures, similar to those experienced by animals. By acknowledging this criticism, Mill prepares to argue that utilitarianism, in fact, recognizes higher intellectual and moral pleasures that are unique to humans, thus making the philosophy more refined and respectable. Quote 8. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. Mill explains that human happiness is distinct from that of animals because humans possess higher faculties. These faculties include intellectual pursuits, emotions, and moral sensibilities. Mill emphasizes that true happiness for humans must involve the fulfillment of these elevated faculties, which goes beyond mere physical pleasure. This distinction is crucial in defending utilitarianism against accusations that it is a philosophy fit only for animals. By asserting the value of intellectual and emotional pleasures, Mill suggests that human beings naturally seek a more complex form of happiness that includes higher forms of gratification, thereby dignifying the utilitarian pursuit of pleasure. Quote 9. It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. Mill clarifies that utilitarianism is not just about the quantity of pleasure, but also its quality. Some pleasures are inherently more valuable than others, and it is essential to consider their qualitative aspects when making moral judgments. For instance, intellectual and emotional pleasures might be considered superior to physical pleasures because they engage higher faculties and contribute more deeply to human fulfillment. By emphasizing the qualitative difference in pleasures, Mill strengthens the utilitarian framework, making it more nuanced and better suited to the complexities of human life. This argument addresses the criticism that utilitarianism oversimplifies human desires by valuing only physical pleasure. Quote 10. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals, for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. Mill uses this statement to illustrate the intrinsic superiority of higher human faculties. He argues that no person who has experienced the pleasures of higher faculties would willingly trade their existence for that of an animal, even if it meant receiving a lifetime of physical satisfaction. This is because intellectual, emotional, and moral pleasures are inherently more fulfilling than mere bodily pleasures. This comparison highlights the depth of human happiness and reinforces Mill's point that utilitarianism values the higher, uniquely human pleasures. It challenges the view that utilitarianism is a base philosophy by demonstrating that human beings naturally prioritize complex forms of well-being over simplistic, animalistic pleasures. Quote 11. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Mill argues that the capacity for higher intellectual and moral pursuits makes human life fundamentally more valuable, even if it comes with dissatisfaction. A life enriched by knowledge, introspection, and moral growth is inherently superior to one limited to physical gratification, even if the latter brings more immediate satisfaction. The comparison between a human and a pig, or between Socrates and a fool, underlines Mill's belief that the quality of happiness matters more than its quantity. By making this assertion, Mill emphasizes that utilitarianism values not only the pursuit of pleasure, but also the cultivation of intellectual and moral excellence, which elevates human life. Quote 12. The happiness which they meant was not a life of rapture, but moments of such, in an existence made up of few and transitory pains, many and various pleasures, with a decided predominance of the active over the passive, and having as the foundation of the whole not to expect more from life than it is capable of bestowing. Mill clarifies that utilitarian happiness is not about constant ecstasy, but rather the accumulation of many smaller, fulfilling moments within a generally balanced life. He emphasizes the importance of having realistic expectations about what life can offer, highlighting that happiness is about managing one's response to pleasure and pain. This balanced approach ensures that happiness is sustainable and attainable for the average person. By presenting happiness as something modest and achievable, Mill attempts to dispel the myth that utilitarianism sets an unrealistic goal of endless joy. Quote 13. The main constituents of a satisfied life appear to be two, either of which by itself is often found sufficient for the purpose: tranquility and excitement. Mill describes tranquility and excitement as two fundamental components of a fulfilled life, both of which can independently lead to satisfaction. He suggests that these two states complement each other, with periods of tranquility preparing individuals for excitement, and vice versa. By defining these key elements of a satisfying life, Mill implies that happiness is not one-dimensional, but can be found in different modes of living. His emphasis on both tranquility and excitement also suggests that variety in emotional experience is crucial for overall well-being. Quote 14. Next to selfishness, the principal cause which makes life unsatisfactory is want of mental cultivation. Mill points out that a lack of mental stimulation is a significant reason why people may find life unfulfilling. He asserts that intellectual development is essential for finding deeper satisfaction in life, as it opens individuals to a broader range of interests and pleasures. By emphasizing mental cultivation, Mill suggests that happiness is not merely about material well-being, but also involves engaging with the world in a thoughtful and informed way. This assertion supports the broader utilitarian idea that intellectual and moral pleasures contribute significantly to overall happiness. Quote 15. The only self-renunciation which it applauds is devotion to the happiness, or to some of the means of happiness, of others, either of mankind collectively, or of individuals within the limits imposed by the collective interests of mankind. Mill argues that utilitarianism values self-sacrifice only when it contributes to the happiness of others. He is critical of self-denial for its own sake, viewing it as valuable only if it leads to a greater good. This perspective places the focus on practical outcomes rather than the act of sacrifice itself, aligning with utilitarianism's broader emphasis on maximizing overall well-being. By advocating for meaningful self-renunciation, Mill highlights that true virtue lies in actions that effectively promote the happiness of others, rather than in empty gestures of self-denial. Quote 16. In the Golden Rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility: to do as one would be done by, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. Mill draws a parallel between the utilitarian principle and the moral teachings of Jesus, emphasizing that the ethical foundation of utilitarianism aligns with the idea of treating others as one would wish to be treated. By doing so, he reinforces that utilitarianism is not devoid of compassion, but deeply rooted in empathy and consideration for others. This comparison aims to counteract the criticism that utilitarianism lacks a moral heart, suggesting instead that it embodies an ideal moral standard that is both accessible and noble. Utilitarians are, quote 17, quite aware that there are other desirable possessions and qualities besides virtue, and are perfectly willing to allow to all of them their full worth. Mill clarifies that utilitarianism does not claim that virtue is the only valuable quality in life. Instead, it acknowledges the worth of various human attributes and experiences beyond mere moral virtue. This perspective makes utilitarianism a more balanced ethical theory that recognizes the richness of human experience, encompassing other values like beauty, knowledge, and personal excellence. Mill's statement counters the criticism that utilitarianism reduces all human actions and qualities to their moral utility alone, suggesting instead that it respects the diverse components of a fulfilling life. Quote 18. A doctrine which brings prominently forward the interest that mankind have in the repression and prevention of conduct which violates the moral law is likely to be inferior to no other in turning the sanctions of opinion against such violations. Mill asserts that utilitarianism, by focusing on promoting the overall happiness of society, is equally capable, if not better, at discouraging immoral conduct as compared to any other ethical doctrine. By emphasizing collective welfare, utilitarianism encourages individuals to avoid actions that harm others, thereby aligning with moral laws and social expectations. This statement aims to refute claims that utilitarianism lacks the means to enforce moral standards, underscoring its effectiveness in motivating individuals to act in the interest of the common good. Quote 19. If it be a true belief that God desires, above all things, the happiness of his creatures, and that this was his purpose in their creation, utility is not only not a godless doctrine, but more profoundly religious than any other. Mill addresses the criticism that utilitarianism is inherently godless by suggesting that if one believes in a benevolent deity whose intention is the happiness of all beings, then utilitarianism aligns well with this divine purpose. He presents utilitarianism as potentially more compatible with religious teachings about the value of happiness than other ethical doctrines. This argument attempts to show that utilitarianism is not opposed to religious morality, but can be viewed as an extension of it, focusing on maximizing the well-being that a benevolent God would want for humanity. Quote 20. The expedient, in this sense, instead of being the same thing with the useful, is a branch of the hurtful. Mill distinguishes between what is expedient in the short term and what is genuinely useful in the long term, arguing that expediency often involves actions that might seem beneficial initially, but ultimately cause harm. He emphasizes that true utility considers the broader and more enduring impacts on well-being, rather than simply pursuing immediate gains. This distinction is crucial in defending utilitarianism against the charge that it justifies unethical behavior if it yields quick benefits. Mill asserts that utilitarian ethics require careful consideration of long-term consequences, not just immediate expediency. Quote 21. There is no ethical creed which does not temper the rigidity of its laws by giving a certain latitude, under the moral responsibility of the agent, for accommodation to peculiarities of circumstances. Mill acknowledges that all ethical systems, including utilitarianism, must allow for flexibility in applying moral rules to real-life situations. He argues that moral decisions often involve complex circumstances that require thoughtful judgment rather than strict adherence to rigid rules. By recognizing the need for adaptability, Mill highlights that utilitarianism is not uniquely flawed in this regard. Rather, it shares this challenge with other moral systems. This flexibility is necessary for addressing the nuanced nature of moral dilemmas, making utilitarianism a practical and adaptable ethical framework. Quote 22. The principle of utility either has, or there is no reason why it might not have, all the sanctions which belong to any other system of morals. Mill argues that utilitarianism can possess the same forms of moral motivation as any other ethical system. These sanctions include external pressures, such as societal approval or divine reward, as well as internal motivations like feelings of conscience. By asserting this, Mill counters the argument that utilitarianism lacks the necessary moral authority to compel individuals to act ethically. He suggests that utilitarian morality can be enforced just as effectively as other moral standards, through similar psychological and social mechanisms. Quote 23. The internal sanction of duty, whatever our standard of duty may be, is one and the same, a feeling in our own mind, a pain, more or less intense, attendant on violation of duty. Mill emphasizes that the ultimate source of moral obligation, regardless of the ethical system one follows, is an internal feeling or conscience. This internal sanction involves emotional discomfort when one fails to fulfill their duty, which serves as a powerful motivator for ethical behavior. Mill's argument here is that utilitarianism can evoke the same kind of internal, psychological response to moral violations as other moral theories, thereby giving it the same capacity to enforce adherence through feelings of guilt or remorse. Quote 24. The ultimate sanction, therefore, of all morality, external motives apart, being a subjective feeling in our own minds, I see nothing embarrassing to those whose standard is utility. In the question, what is the sanction of that particular standard? Mill asserts that the foundation of all morality lies in subjective feelings within individuals. For utilitarianism, like other moral theories, this internal feeling is what gives moral rules their binding force. He argues that utilitarian morality is supported by the same internal motivations that drive adherence to other moral systems. This statement aims to demystify the criticism that utilitarianism lacks an intrinsic force compelling individuals to follow its tenets, suggesting instead that its sanction is rooted in the same human emotions that underpin any ethical behavior. Quote 25. The social state is at once so natural, so necessary, and so habitual to man that, except in some unusual circumstances, or by an effort of voluntary abstraction, he never conceives himself otherwise than as a member of a body. Mill highlights the inherently social nature of human beings, arguing that people naturally see themselves as part of a larger community. This sense of belonging leads individuals to consider the interests of others as integral to their own well-being. Mill uses this idea to support utilitarianism by suggesting that the motivation to care about the happiness of others is deeply rooted in our social instincts. This communal perspective makes it easier for utilitarian principles to resonate with individuals, as they align with an innate desire for harmony within society. Quote 26. This conviction is the ultimate sanction of the greatest happiness morality. Mill concludes that the deeply ingrained social feeling, the conviction that one's well-being is connected to that of others, is the ultimate motivator for utilitarianism. This sense of unity with fellow humans serves as the strongest internal motivator to act in a way that promotes the general happiness. By identifying this sentiment as the core of utilitarian morality, Mill reinforces the idea that utilitarianism is not an abstract or imposed system, but one that is compatible with the natural tendencies of human nature towards social cooperation and empathy. Quote 27. The sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. Mill argues that the proof of something being desirable lies in the fact that people genuinely desire it. He uses this as a basis for his claim that happiness is the ultimate end because people universally desire their own happiness. This perspective shifts the focus from abstract moral reasoning to observable human behavior, suggesting that desire is the fundamental measure of value. By grounding the concept of desirability in human experience, Mill presents an empirical approach to establishing moral ends, reinforcing the utilitarian argument that happiness is the primary goal of human action. Quote 28. Virtue, according to the utilitarian doctrine, is not naturally and originally part of the end, but it is capable of becoming so. Mill explains that while virtue may not initially be an end in itself, it can become intrinsically desirable through its association with happiness. In utilitarianism, virtue starts as a means to achieve happiness, but over time, it can be valued independently. This idea shows that utilitarianism allows for the development of moral character, where people may come to value virtuous actions for their own sake, contributing to their happiness. Mill's explanation addresses critics who argue that utilitarianism does not account for moral values beyond mere pleasure, demonstrating that it can foster a deep appreciation for virtue. Quote 29. In being desired for its own sake, it is, however, desired as part of happiness. Mill clarifies that when something initially desired as a means becomes desired for its own sake, it is incorporated into a person's conception of happiness. This means that happiness is not a simple or homogeneous concept. It is a complex whole composed of various elements that people come to value intrinsically. By including these elements within the definition of happiness, Mill shows that utilitarianism accounts for a wide range of human desires and motivations, not just immediate pleasure, thus making the theory more robust and comprehensive in capturing human well-being. Quote 30. There is, in reality, nothing desired except happiness. Mill argues that all human desires ultimately contribute to happiness, either as a means to achieve it or as parts of happiness itself. He suggests that even seemingly distinct desires, like the pursuit of virtue or wealth, are ultimately tied to an individual's happiness. By framing all desires as components of happiness, Mill reinforces the utilitarian principle that happiness is the ultimate end of all human actions. This assertion aims to establish that the pursuit of happiness is the fundamental criterion for evaluating moral actions. Quote 31. Will, in the beginning, is entirely produced by desire, including in that term the repelling influence of pain as well as the attractive one of pleasure. Mill discusses the relationship between will and desire, arguing that will originates from desire. He explains that initially, individuals act based on their desires to seek pleasure or avoid pain, but over time, habits can form, allowing actions to be performed even without conscious desire. This shows that utilitarianism acknowledges the role of habit and willpower in shaping behavior, while still ultimately tying moral action to the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. Mill's view highlights the interplay between desire, will, and habit, emphasizing that even cultivated behaviors have their roots in the fundamental pursuit of happiness. Quote 32. The powerful sentiment and apparently clear perception, which that word recalls with a rapidity and certainty resembling an instinct, have seemed to the majority of thinkers to point to an inherent quality in things. Mill explains that the concept of justice evokes a powerful and instinctive response, leading many to believe that justice is an inherent quality, distinct from the idea of expediency. People often perceive justice as an absolute value, existing naturally, rather than as a concept derived from practical considerations. This perception creates a challenge for utilitarianism, which seeks to define morality based on the promotion of happiness. Mill suggests that understanding the origin of our feelings about justice is crucial to determining whether justice truly stands apart from utility or is a part of it. Quote 33. The feeling of justice might be a peculiar instinct, and might yet require, like our other instincts, to be controlled and enlightened by a higher reason. Mill acknowledges that the sense of justice may originate as a natural human instinct. However, he argues that, Like other instincts, it must be guided and refined by rational thought. This means that even if justice is deeply ingrained in human nature, it still requires examination through reason to ensure that it aligns with broader moral principles, such as utility. By asserting this, Mill challenges the notion that the instinctive feeling of justice is infallible, suggesting instead that it must be critically evaluated to ensure it serves the greater good. Quote 34. A second case of injustice consists in taking or withholding from any person that to which he has a moral right. Mill identifies one form of injustice as denying someone their moral rights, even if those rights are not legally recognized. This distinction between legal rights and moral rights highlights the limitations of law in determining what is just. Mill argues that justice transcends the legal system, and that true justice involves respecting moral rights, which may or may not be reflected in existing laws. By making this distinction, Mill shows that utilitarianism seeks to address not only the legal aspects of justice, but also the deeper moral concerns that contribute to human well-being. Quote 35. It is universally considered just that each person should obtain that, whether good or evil, which he deserves, and unjust that he should obtain a good, or be made to undergo an evil, which he does not deserve. Mill explains that a fundamental aspect of justice is the idea of desert, that people should receive outcomes that correspond to their actions, whether rewards for good behavior or punishment for wrongdoing. This concept of justice is widely accepted and reflects a natural human desire for fairness. However, Mill points out that determining what someone deserves is complex and often subject to different interpretations. By discussing desert, Mill highlights that utilitarianism must account for people's sense of fairness, ensuring that actions and consequences align with what is perceived as deserved to maintain social harmony. Quote 36. The idea of penal sanction, which is the essence of law, enters not only into the conception of injustice, but into that of any kind of wrong. Mill argues that the concept of justice inherently involves the idea of punishment or sanction for wrongdoing. This is what distinguishes actions that are merely expedient from those that are morally obligatory. Justice implies that there are consequences for failing to fulfill one's duties, whether those consequences are legal, social, or personal, such as guilt. By framing justice in terms of enforceable obligations, Mill suggests that utilitarianism must consider the importance of sanctions in maintaining moral order and encouraging behaviors that promote overall happiness. Quote 37. This, therefore, being the characteristic difference which marks off, not justice, but morality in general, from the remaining provinces of expediency and worthiness. Mill explains that the distinction between morality and expediency lies in the sense of duty and obligation. In morality, actions are seen as obligatory, whereas in expediency, actions are considered desirable but not mandatory. This distinction helps differentiate moral conduct from actions that are merely beneficial or praiseworthy. Mill suggests that the moral obligation to act comes with a sense of compulsion or duty that goes beyond mere convenience or utility, highlighting that morality carries a stronger imperative to act in certain ways, distinct from what might be expedient. Quote 38. Justice implies something which it is not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. Mill defines justice as involving not only moral obligations, but also specific rights that individuals can claim. Justice, therefore, is distinct from other virtues like generosity or beneficence, which do not entail specific claims by others. The concept of justice is tied to the idea that someone has a right to demand certain treatment or actions from others, making it a more stringent requirement compared to other moral duties. This emphasis on rights distinguishes justice from general acts of kindness, underlining its enforceable nature within moral and social systems. Quote 39. The sentiment of justice, in that one of its elements, which consists of the desire to punish, is thus, I conceive, the natural feeling of retaliation or vengeance, rendered by intellect and sympathy applicable to those injuries, that is, to those hurts, which wound us through, or in common with, society at large. Mill describes the sentiment of justice as stemming from a natural feeling of retaliation, refined by intellect and social sympathy. This desire to retaliate against harm is not merely instinctual, but is shaped by the individual's understanding of the broader societal impact. Justice, therefore, is not simply about personal revenge. It involves protecting the collective interests of society. Mill's explanation suggests that the moral component of justice emerges when personal feelings of retaliation are subordinated to the welfare of society, making justice a social sentiment concerned with protecting the common good. Quote 40. The idea of justice supposes two things: a rule of conduct and a sentiment which sanctions the rule. Mill argues that the concept of justice involves both a rule of conduct and a sentiment that enforces adherence to this rule. Justice requires a shared understanding of certain behaviors as obligatory, as well as a collective emotional response that motivates individuals to enforce these behaviors. This dual aspect, objective rules and subjective sentiments, forms the foundation of justice. The rule provides the guideline for action, while the sentiment gives it the moral weight necessary for enforcement, indicating that justice is both a rational and emotional construct within human societies. Quote 41. If the preceding analysis, or something resembling it, be not the correct account of the notion of justice, if justice be totally independent of utility and be a standard per se, which the mind can recognize by simple introspection of itself, it is hard to understand why that internal oracle is so ambiguous. Mill challenges the notion that justice is an independent, self-evident principle by questioning why, if it were truly an absolute standard, there is so much disagreement over its application. He points out that differing opinions on what is just suggest that justice is not as clear-cut or universally recognized as some claim. By highlighting this ambiguity, Mill argues for a utilitarian understanding of justice, one that is rooted in considerations of utility and the well-being of society, rather than an abstract, introspective standard. This perspective implies that justice should be evaluated based on its contribution to human happiness and social stability, rather than being seen as an inherently fixed or infallible principle. Quote 42. With many, the test of justice in penal infliction is that the punishment should be proportioned to the offense, meaning that it should be exactly measured by the moral guilt of the culprit. Mill explains that some people believe justice in punishment requires that the penalty be proportionate to the moral guilt of the offender, while others believe it should only be as much as necessary to deter future offenses. This highlights differing views on what constitutes just punishment, whether it is retributive, focusing on moral guilt, or utilitarian, emphasizing social deterrence. These conflicting perspectives on justice illustrate how moral judgments are influenced by underlying values and goals, and why different interpretations of justice often lead to debate over what constitutes a fair response to wrongdoing. Quote 43. Who shall decide between these appeals to conflicting principles of justice? Justice has in this case two sides to it, which it is impossible to bring into harmony. Mill points out that justice often involves conflicting principles, such as whether it is just to reward individuals based on effort or to compensate for inequalities. In these cases, different perspectives on justice may lead to irreconcilable views, making any decision based on justice alone seem arbitrary. Mill suggests that social utility is the only criterion capable of resolving such conflicts, implying that practical outcomes for the greater good should guide decisions when justice principles clash. Quote 44. The moral rules which forbid mankind to hurt one another are more vital to human well-being than any maxims, however important, which only point out the best mode of managing some department of human affairs. Mill argues that moral rules preventing harm are more essential to human well-being than rules merely intended to manage specific aspects of society. These fundamental moral rules ensure personal safety and maintain social trust, making them the cornerstone of justice. Mill suggests that the importance of these rules is reflected in the powerful social and personal incentives to uphold them. This focus on the fundamental role of non-harm in human well-being underscores why justice, which primarily aims to prevent harm, is considered a paramount moral value. Quote 45. Justice is a name for certain classes of moral rules, which concern the essentials of human well-being more nearly, and are therefore of more absolute obligation than any other rules for the guidance of life. Mill defines justice as a set of moral rules that are more directly related to the essentials of human well-being than other moral guidelines. Because these rules deal with core aspects of human life, such as protection from harm and fair treatment, they carry a stronger obligation than less vital moral rules. Mill's view positions justice as the most critical aspect of morality, given its role in safeguarding the fundamental interests of individuals and society. Quote 46. Justice remains the appropriate name for certain social utilities which are vastly more important, and therefore more absolute and imperative, than any others are as a class. Mill concludes that justice represents certain social utilities that are significantly more important than others, making them absolute and imperative in nature. He emphasizes that justice involves moral rules that must be upheld for the well-being of society, distinguishing them from mere expediency or convenience. This understanding of justice places it at the core of utilitarian ethics, recognizing it as an essential framework for ensuring social stability and collective happiness. Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill concludes by reiterating that utility, or the greatest happiness principle, is central to moral reasoning. Mill contends that justice, while distinct and powerful as a concept, is inherently tied to utilitarian ethics as it serves the broader goal of maximizing well-being. The book highlights that moral feelings, social obligations, and justice converge in the pursuit of happiness, thereby making utilitarianism a robust framework for understanding right and wrong. Through its nuanced examination of morality, Mill invites readers to reflect on their actions within the context of the collective good.
Curious to dive into the mind of John Stuart Mill? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of utilitarianism in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.